Hey guys, welcome to HipHughes History. In the news recently, you might have seen that 2 states out west, Colorado and Washington, legalized recreational marijuana. So what we want to do in this mini quick lecture is really take a look at the history of marijuana through the context of federalism in American history. And if you've seen HipHughes lectures before, you know the definition of federalism. Federalism is the division of power between the federal government and the state governments. So looking at that relationship throughout American history is going to bring us today, and then it's going to bring you to comment below to show us what you think or tell us what your opinion is about whether marijuana should be legalized, whether it should be regulated, whether it should be medicinal only, whether the federal government has a leg to stand on. So, beep beep, let the learning begin. In 1619, King James I regulated that all English settlers had to grow 100 crops, 100 plants, and export those plants back to England. This is the beginning of triangular trade, right? So one of those plants that became highly sought after and was easy to grow and kind of fought like with tobacco and later cotton as a major American crop is going to be hemp. And marijuana, what people smoke, comes from the flower of the hemp plant, cannabis. That hemp is used for paper, it's used for cloth, it's used for rope. It's a very sought after raw material. And in fact, throughout colonial history, throughout the 1600s into the 1700s, it became like an American commodity. Debts were paid off with hemp. Thomas Jefferson, a botanist, grew hemp, many different strands of hemp. George Washington's third most grown crop was hemp. And hemp was just kind of a way of American colonial life. And we're not saying people smoked it, and we're not talking about that kind of drug law kind of thing yet, but as a raw material, definitely hemp is part of America. So let's fast forward and go into poison laws. Poison laws, like the Snow White thing, poison? I smell a civil war. Right around the era of the Civil War, we start to see kind of a change in how states begin to deal, not just with marijuana, but with drugs in general. There were really no drug laws before the 1850s and the 1840s, so, I mean, you could take some death and put it into a little pool of death and sell it as a cure to death. So these laws were necessary. So hemp, depending on where you were, was labeled differently. The poison laws were different. And in some states you were allowed to use it. Some states you needed to get it from a pharmacy, or it had to be labeled. Sometimes it was labeled as poison, but you still could get it. But nevertheless, it's kind of a hodgepodge of different laws. I think that it begins to become interlaced with nativism around this time as well, because we do see a clamping down in California and on the East Coast, kind of with the opium and the hashish dens that were connected with the Asian culture. And we also see kind of the beginning of an influx in the Southwest through the Mexican culture, bringing marijuana, Mexican soldiers using marijuana to chill, I guess, in the 1840s and the 1850s, and crossing the border, or, well, border, what are we doing here? My goodness, it's not even the Mexican War. But nevertheless, let's go into the turn of the century, and as we get closer to the turn of the century, the federal government's going to begin to put its hands down on the issue of marijuana. With a pile of muck and a rake, you can change the world. And muckraking, specifically, there's a lot of muckrakers, but Upton Sinclair's The Jungle is the big one, that leads the federal government down the road of regulation when it comes to food and drugs. First the Meat Inspection Act, and then the Pure Food and Drug Act, which created the FDA. And we have to give props to this. It's going to create uniformity in labeling food, uniformity in medicine, and knowing what you're ingesting into your system. This creates really the first kind of national laws that are going to at least label hemp, label marijuana, so people know what kinds of product it's in. And this is not just for marijuana, but all drugs. But in the 1920s, we really see an uptick in kind of anti-marijuana laws on the state level, more kind of what you'd say poison laws. And some historians have pointed out that there's a coincidence with depression and recession, like in the crash of 1929, right around that time period, that, you know, immigrants being linked to marijuana, not being wanted because of their competitiveness for cheap labor, you know, kind of more of a nativism kind of throwdown there. But the big change comes with the National Bureau of Narcotics, which is created under FDR's watch in 1932. And it's first led by Harry Anslinger. Anslinger, and Harry Anslinger is going to be marijuana's worst nightmare. So I'm going to get really mad. I'm going to get some reefer, and we're going to do some reefer madness right now. This is what marijuana will do to your child. Reefer madness is just one aspect of kind of the first drug war that's launched by Harry Anslinger in the 1930s against marijuana and other drugs as well. With very little evidence, anecdotal evidence, if anything, he's linking marijuana with sex craziness and violence and murder and robbery and death, and definitely had a vendetta against marijuana, whether it's authentic or as some conspiratorial people, and I'm not going to play this up too much, but really say it's kind of a William Randolph Hearst thing. William Randolph Hearst, the great newspaper, well, powerful newspaper editor, some credit with getting America to go into the Spanish-American War through yellow journalism and kind of pumping up the anti-Spanish kind of brutality that was going on in Cuba, and now using his newspaper to kind of spread the propaganda about marijuana. And one of the reasons that these people point this relationship out is because William Randolph Hearst has a huge investment in timber and in paper, and hemp would represent competition to him. So by making it illegal and eventually getting the 1937 Marijuana Tax Act, it's going to make it unaffordable for any government agency or medical agency to use it. So the 1937 Marijuana Tax Act basically made marijuana illegal, and if you wanted to use it for any type of reason, whether it's medical or governmental, you could get a stamp, a marijuana stamp, but it was thousands of dollars, so you wouldn't be able to afford that. So Harry Anslinger, through Reefer Madness, through his connections with the Hearst family, and other people have pointed out the DuPont family with kind of chemicals and competition, medicinal marijuana. There's a lot of conspiratorial kind of things going on, but we're going to stick to the history here. So as we go through the 1940s and the 1950s, you do see some opposition to the marijuana laws, particularly by was a Mayor LaGuardia in New York City, who did a whole bunch of series of research and reports on what Anslinger had done, and kind of discredited him through a series of reports. But that really doesn't change the level, the playing field too much. So we're gonna coast into the 1960s, and as kind of marijuana becomes more widespread and in use, eventually we're going to see a challenge to it and a redirection of governmental power. So remember, the 1937 Marijuana Tax Act is really the economic and the governmental forceful way of going after marijuana. Timothy Leary. Man, you should do a video just on Timothy Leary. Timothy Leary is a Harvard psychologist who has a lot to do with acid and the electric Kool-Aid acid tests and all of this craziness. But Leary versus United States is actually the Supreme Court case that took down the Marijuana Tax Act. And it's a long story. It has to do with the Mexican border and self-incrimination in the Fifth Amendment, but that bad boy is knocked down and it needs to be replaced. So Richard Nixon, under his guidance, we get in the 1970s a series of control acts, and these are basically going to label drugs by levels, and if it's like level 1, it can't be used. So marijuana was a control level 1 drug in the 1970s, and it is basically off limits now because of its danger kind of element. So we go through the 1970s, and then we're going to lead ourselves. You know, there was a little bump in California who decriminalized it in the sense of knocking it down to a misdemeanor, but that's going to change. So Ronald Reagan is going to be the just say no guy. Actually, it's Nancy Reagan, who was his wife, who went on kind of a kick of just say no. And I can remember, because I grew up in the early 1980s, and I can remember watching Different Strokes, and Nancy Reagan was on Different Strokes telling everybody just say no. The first anti-drug programs for children like DARE were created out of this effort, and the federal government is going to use this opportunity to pass strict drug laws, specifically related to mandatory sentencing. So sentencing guidelines are coming out now that are kind of applicable to the states, so we get a larger federal kind of governmental control aspect to this, that are telling judges this is what we recommend. So if you're arrested with, X amount of ounces or whatever, you're going to get X amount of years. And in some cases, there's even 3-strike laws that say, you know, on your third offense, if you are arrested even with a small amount of marijuana and you're selling it, that you get life imprisonment. So we're going to see a backlash now coming in the 1990s to kind of the federal government power with these control acts and with these mandatory sentencing through the experimentation of the states, initiatives, and propositions. All right, I propose that we do a proposition. So, California, baby, Proposition 215. A proposition is put on the ballot by voters of a state. They have this out west a lot, and if the voters pass it, it becomes law. It can still be challenged in court, but it becomes law for the moment. So, Proposition 215 in 1996 passed, right? It passed. So, California is taking ownership, I think, using its democratic mechanisms and the idea that this should be regulated by the state of California, and it's going to allow for medical marijuana. So that's exactly what they start doing. They open up the Oakland Cannabis Buyers Co-op and start, you know, peddling marijuana for people that have doctor's prescriptions for, you know, again, we're not doing a medical lecture here, but glaucoma or, you know, chemotherapy, you know, effects or whatever it might be. And the federal government, DEA, comes in gangsta style. Like, you know, kicks the doors down, arrests everybody, breaks up the co-op. So we have a Supreme Court case here. This is a Supreme Court case in Federalism. And this is United States versus Oakland Cannabis Buyers Co-op. So what the Supreme Court now has the opportunity to do is to rule on this bad boy about whether the state has the ability to regulate marijuana or if this is a federal government gig. And the Supreme Court rules in the favor of the United States government, stating that the control acts and kind of the necessity for the federal government to be able to identify dangerous drugs is supreme. This is kind of a supremacy clause case over the right of the citizens of California to legalize that dangerous narcotic. So stating that there's no evidence that it has any medicinal uses, they're going to side with the United States and those bad boys go down. But that doesn't stop California, and for the past 20 years, they've been challenging that. But we get another Supreme Court case in Gonzalez versus Raich. This is the Attorney General Gonzalez under George Bush versus a citizen of California that was using medicinal marijuana, growing it or using it, was arrested, and is again stating their individual liberty to, use marijuana under the state law of California. Again, challenging the supremacy of the federal government. But this time the federal government kind of backs away from, the health standard issue and says it's not just that, but it's interstate commerce. And that because marijuana grown in California doesn't necessarily stay in California, that it does transfer through the illegal drug trade, that this gives the federal government the ability to regulate that. This is the same argument that was used a little bit in health insurance. It's been used to regulate all kinds of things in America that cross state lines, because the idea is if it crosses state lines, you can't have all of these hodgepodge state laws that are dealing with it differently in the states, but you need some type of uniformity. So here we are now in 2012, and the citizens of Colorado and Washington have gone one step further, and they've legalized not just medical marijuana, but recreational marijuana to be treated no different than like alcohol or tobacco. So what will Obama do? There's a couple questions and some things that we can have you guys comment on, but Obama is a Democratic, liberal. Liberals are generally for, the use of marijuana up to the person. Liberty, liberalism. Conservatives, on the other hand, are generally for states' rights, but generally in the social aspect, they're, against, the use of drugs. They see it as a gateway issue that, we need some type of law and order in the society, or everybody's going to be smoking pot, being lazy, not going to work. But you also have conservatives that are libertarians. Libertarians, the root of libertarian being liberty. Give me liberty or give me death. Many conservatives, especially younger conservatives that are libertarians, believe that it should be up to the states, it should be up to the individuals to decide, and that this is another example of, big federal government trying to run our lives. So ideologically, people are all over the map on this, and I'm really dying to hear for people that are not just against marijuana, We also have conservatives that are libertarians, right? The Ron Paul people out there. Ron Paul people are going, hey, don't lump me in that category. I got liberty all over my ideological label, libertarianism. So this is give me liberty or give me death. If I were to ingest a chemical or smoke drugs or do whatever, that should be up to me, and I should have to suffer the consequences. We don't need a nanny state. We don't need the big federal government telling us how much soda to drink or whether or not we should be able to ingest marijuana. So this is a commonality that liberals and libertarians have. I knew we could get you guys together. And also, this is something that, believe it or not, conservatives, in the traditional religious sense, have in common with President Obama. My brain just exploded. Subscribe to HipHughes History. Subscribe to those EDU gurus in my description below and some of the geniuses that are down there that'll make your brain grow 5 times larger. Make sure you subscribe to Polypop too, because that's another great channel and I can't just keep talking forever. So it's time to go. So ding dong. Learning's done. Don't smoke dope.